let's recap the Beaks of Finches lab that we did in class. Remember, this is one of our mandatory state labs, so we just want to make sure that you review all of the concepts from the lab so that we can have some decent information to be able to take that Part D of the New York State assessment. So our Beaks of Finches lab, the idea behind this one is that Charles Darwin studied beak varieties of different types of birds, the finches, that he saw on the Galapagos Islands while he was doing his studies and tours of the world. The finches migrated to isolated islands with different selecting or selection agents or pressures. Each of the islands had their own food sources, there were different organisms present, they had their own kind of little micro-environments. In the end, it was something that created a force that gave an organism an advantage over another. One island might have a totally different seed than another island did. This would help some organisms to survive a little bit better if their beak was most adapted for those types of foods. In the end, we end up having speciation occur. A new species will result, and this often occurs because of several different reasons. We have a founding new population. We have geographic isolation, so each of the islands is isolated from each other. A lot of times the only way that a bird got to another island was during a storm, some heavy winds. Sometimes they really just didn't go to the other islands and go back and forth. Once they were there, they usually stayed there. Another reason is the gene pool of the population. That population that came to the new island had maybe a different gene pool than the overall entire population that originated on the first island where they first existed. Maybe some of the traits weren't necessarily represented, or maybe not represented in the same frequencies as the original population. Let's say maybe in the original population there was an equal distribution of different types of beaks because there was a variety of foods. Maybe then when they migrated to a new island, maybe it was mostly, and perhaps just out of chance, birds that had larger beaks, not necessarily some of the ones with the small beaks. Sometimes, eventually, they have reproductive isolation. These birds no longer can reproduce with each other due to structural and physical differences. The biggest one that we're going to talk about from this lab is competition. They're competing for various resources that can be limited: food, shelter, space, mates. So let's take a look at the lab itself and some of the specific information from the lab. We had our tools, which represented the different types of beaks. We used 3 different tools in this lab. We used a pair of pliers, we used a clothespin, and we used a pair of forceps or tweezers. Which tool do you think really represented a beak that was used to crush tough seeds? Was it the pliers, the clothespin, or the tweezers? Think about the shape, think about the structure, and you're right. In the end, more than likely, most of us would pick the pliers because they're a strong, very thick beak, very crushing capabilities compared to maybe something like the clothespin or the very skinny forceps or tweezers. Think about which tool was used and best used to probe, kind of poke at, and dig for things like insects or get into flowers for pollen. Would it be the pliers, the clothespin, or the forceps or tweezers? You're right if you said it would be the forceps or tweezers. They have a very pointy tip to them compared to a clothespin and a pair of pliers. They're a little clumsy when it comes to the smaller things like the insects and digging into deep spots. In our lab, the beans represented food. In the beginning, we had some very small lentils, very tiny beans, and if you went to the new island, there were some larger white beans, which maybe were a little bit easier to pick up if you were kind of clumsy with those smaller, tiny, itty-bitty beans. So one question we had to ask ourselves was which beak might be best adapted for the small beans and why? Well, in some cases, some people might have been very good at picking up the small beans with their pliers because they found a funky way to be able to pick them up. In a lot of cases, the clothespins were very clumsy just due to their simple shape and everything for most people. Some people had very good luck with the forceps. They were nice and skinny. They could be very exact at picking up those tiny little beans. Sometimes it depended on how well you were able to use your tool and not necessarily the tool itself. For round 1, we had several phases for this lab. When we first started out in round 1, there was no competition with other organisms, whether it be your mate or organisms of a different beak type. So in this case, the food wasn't a limiting factor. You were able to feed out of a tray all by yourself. You did have a limited time, but there was plenty of food for you to eat. You only needed to get a certain number of pieces in order to survive to the next round. So the nice thing is you really basically had it all to yourself. It was like having your own private island. In this case, the organisms that survived were the ones that were most adapted because they would be able to get enough food in order to survive and then move on to the next round, possibly even reproduce with their mate. If you didn't get enough food in this first round, just like if you didn't eat enough food today, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to die right away, but you're going to have to find some food pretty quickly. So in our lab, if you didn't get enough food in the first round, you migrated to a new island. And on that new island, you had large seeds, where everybody in the first round were feeding on small seeds in the first island. So in this case, when you migrated to the new island, the nice thing is in the next round, there might not be any other birds there, so you were still dealing with a very low level of competition. So it was just a matter of whether or not you could find your food. So one thing to ask yourself is which type of beak was most successful at this first round? Sometimes it did vary based on the class. In a lot of cases, it turns out that the forceps were the most successful, the tweezers. They had that nice fine beak to be able to pick up the beans very easily, those tiny little seeds. Most people were too clumsy with the end shape of the clothespins, and sometimes the pliers were just too big and clunky to be able to grab those little seeds. So when we had no competition and food was not a limiting factor, neither was space or anything like that, it seems like most of the time the forceps were pretty well adapted. If you survived this round, you got to move on to round 2. And round 2 and 3 were very similar to each other. In round 2, you competed against one other person, and that other person had a different beak type. So we had some competition. We had limited food and limited space. You weren't given more food in this situation, and you had to eat that food with someone else trying to eat and feed at the same time. So you were in a confined space. So now you're sharing space and you're sharing the same amount of food. And the other problem is you're competing against a person with another beak type. The results, some people didn't end up surviving the second round. So in this case, if you didn't survive the second round, you got to migrate to a new island and try out another island. The conclusion, best adapted individuals were able to compete more effectively for food and survive to move on to round 3. Round 3 had increased competition. The increased competition, everybody at the table, so now 4 people were competing for the same amount of food as we did before and in the same space. So we had very high competition in terms of food availability and space availability. So really, truly, in the end, the ones that were best adapted were able to get the most food, they were able to survive and move on to the next round, reproduce, pass on their traits to their offspring. So in some cases, we need to think about why was it more difficult to get enough food? It's pretty easy to answer. We had less space, we had less food, and we have people fighting now in order to be able to get it. So sometimes, in some cases, the real true desire to get the food came into play as well. Sometimes we were pecking at each other, trying to get the food away from another one. Sometimes you wasted too much time fighting with another organism to get the food, and sometimes that made it even harder for you. The biggest thing is the organisms, the finches or birds, that could pick up the food the best were the ones that were able to survive. And one thing we just discussed was, did survival rely on beak, type of food, or space? And in many cases, if you had migrated to the new island, there was less competition. Not as many birds had migrated to that new island. But the biggest thing is you had a bigger seed. You were really able to pick up that seed a little bit better because you were able to grab it and grasp it better with your beak. So rounds 2 and 3 really were because we had a lot of competition, and the organisms that were able to truly compete for that food were the ones that survived. They were the ones that were most adapted. So if you think about it, in the end, the birds that couldn't compete, if it all happened to be, let's say, the clothespins, which happened to be many of our classes, those birds with the clothespin type beaks would be the ones that didn't survive. If they don't survive, they're not alive to reproduce, to pass on that trait. So in the end, we would think that over time, birds that are very poorly adapted for their environment, the frequency of that trait should decrease over time and maybe eventually even become extinct if the selecting pressures were just so heavy against that beak type. The organisms that were best adapted, they survived, they were able to pass on their traits to their offspring if it was genetically based, and then those offspring would survive and pass on again. So the ones that were most adapted, their numbers should increase over time in the population to be a higher frequency than the ones that were not best adapted.